So we're up to Daf Ayin Tesamid Beis, Mi Motzi Miad Mi. We're talking about a person who gave away all his money and he writes a shtar, and the issue is as follows. If he was a Shchiv Mirah when he wrote the shtar, then the matana is betela. But if on the other hand he was a bari, then the matana is valid. And now the question is, if we don't know whether he was a bari or a shchiv meirah at the time that he wrote the shtar, who has the schus to be motzi the mammon me'asheni? And the Bryce establishes that who motzi miyadam below raya. In other words, he, the nosei matana, has credibility to claim that he was a shchiv meirah at the time of the Nesina, and therefore the shtar is batel, because a shchiv meirah cannot give away all his money. So he's believed to say that he was a shchiv meirah at the time of the Nesina. V'hein ein motziin v'yada. But those who receive the guests, they don't have any rights to the money. They can't take the money and be tofesid below raya unless they could prove that he was absolutely healthy and a bari at the time that he gave the Nesina, Divrei Rabbi Yaakov. Rabbi Nassan disagrees. Omer, she'im barihu, if right now, at this moment, he's a bari, olav lavi raya shal yeshchiv meirah. He wants to say that when he gave the gift yesterday or a week ago, a month ago, he was a shchiv meirah. He has to prove that. And he's not going to be believed unless he has a raya, because there's a chazaka that hashta barihu, now he's a bari, and yesterday he was also a bari. So that Rabbi Nassan builds everything on what we call the chazaka de hashta, like we spoke about in the case of the mikvah, that right now it's chaser, harei chaser lefanecha, v'im shchiv meirahu. But if right now he is a shchiv meirah, then we assume he was a shchiv meirah yesterday when he gave the matana, and that's called lefanecha. And therefore, if they want to say, no, yesterday he was a bari, they have to bring a raya. Because again, according to Rabbi Nassan, everything depends upon the chazaka hashta. And the Gemara wants to suggest that the machlokes Rav and Shmuel about whether or not we're choshesh for the Kiddushin Av depends upon this machlokes. Tanoim. Name, what should we say? Rav, the Omar Rav, who says we look at the chazaka hashta. And now we know that she's a Bogeres, and therefore we assume she was a Bogeres at the time her father was Makabel Kiddushin, therefore the Kiddushin is invalid, and therefore she doesn't need to get from the suitor of the father. Rabbi Nassan, Rav is holding like Rabbi Nassan, who says that everything depends on the Chazaka Hashta. And since right now, says Rabbi Nassan, he's a Bari, we assume he was a Bari at the time of Matana. If he's now a shchiv meirah, we assume he was a shchiv meirah at the time of the matana. Shmuel di Omar ki Rabbi Yaakov. Shmuel, on the other hand, who is choshesh mitzad safek to the Kiddushin Av, it means that according to Shmuel, we assume, despite the state that he's in now, that it's possible he was in a different state earlier, and we don't go basa chazaka hashta. He would reflect the shita of Rabbi Yaakov, who says that it doesn't depend upon the situation that we find him in now. And the Gemara answers no. Ki Amar Rav. Rav is going to claim, Ano di Amri Afilu ki Rabbi Yaakov. I can square even with the shita of Rabbi Yaakov. Ad kan lo Amar Rabbi Yaakov Hasan. When did Rabbi Yaakov say that we could disregard the chazaka dahashta? And even though now he's a bari, we believe that since he's a bari now, we assume that he was a bari yesterday when he gave him matana. That's Hassam. Why? What we're going to do is we're going to say that he was a bari then, and the money bechezkasa was biyad hanosein, right? The giver of the gift had chazak on the money. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yaakov, which is the first opinion, we're not going to look at the chazak at Asher, he's a bari, but rather we're going to believe him that at the time of Matana, he was a shchiv meirah, and therefore we're going to invalidate the matana, and we're going to apply the principle of Hamid Maman al Chizkasav al Hacha. But here in the case of Kiddushin, mi nema Hamid Guf al Chizkaso. Should we say that since yesterday she was a Nara, then we assume that she was a Nara at the time of the father's accepting of Kiddushin? We know that this happened at the end of the 6-month period between Naras and Bagus. Sorry. And we know that Hachazaka changes on that end of the 6-month period, because on that day that the 6-month period ends, she's Asuya Lishtano. So it's a Chazaka Asuya Lishtano. She's going to have Simoni Bagrus. And therefore, we say that we're not going to consider the Chazaka of Narus, meaning the original Hamed Guf al Chazkos. And Shmuel Amar, I can square off Afilu li Rabbi Nosson. I'd kind of look on Rabbi Nosson, Hasan, in the case of Matana. But it was based on the Kuliyama Cheskas Briam Kaimi. The whole world is assumed to be buried. We don't assume anyone is a Shkimera. Man de Kamapik Nafshe Mechazaka Havialela Suye Raya. He wants to establish himself as a Shkimera against the Chazaka Briam. He has the burden of proof resting on his shoulders. Therefore, if today he's a bari, and he says that yesterday when he gave the gift, he was a shkimira, he has to bring a raya, because he's contradicted by the chazaka that the whole Welt is briam. Now is sugiv Kiddushay and Kiddushay Abbas. Here we have a genuine suffix. Did she become a bogeres in the morning? Or no, maybe now she became a bogeres, but at the time of the Nesina, she was still a nara. She's not undermining the chazaka that came before that she was a nara, and therefore there are many naros who will only bring simonim of bagrus later on in the day. On the other hand, she's already changed the chazaka, so we really have a suffix, and therefore we require a get from both Kiddushay Av and Kiddushay Ben. Gemara goes on and says maybe the machlokas Rav and Shul depends upon a different machlokas Tanoim. Nema Kehani Tanoi. Itcha via Baderech. And after the father was Makabel Kiddushin, Abef his daughter, the Kidsha Atzma Ba'ir, she went ahead and she received Kiddushin on her own. And now we check her out to see, is she a Nara or is she already a Bogeres? Varei Bogeres. And we find out that right now she's a Bogeres. Tana Chad, according to one Brisa, the Kiddushay Aviyah Batel, because we assume Chazak Hashta now, she's a Bogeres, then when the father was Makabel Kiddush, she was already a Bogeres. And that's called Arei Bogeres Lefanenu, like the case of Mikvah of Arei Chasa Lefanenu. Tanya Iduch, another Bryce on the other hand, says Chayshinu Kedushay Shneim. She'll need a get from both. In other words, we recognize the possibility that the Kedushay Av are valid. And we're not concerned with the fact that now she's a Bogeres. My love, Chad Kirav, Chad Kishmuel. Why don't we assume that one Bryce reflects the sheet of Rav, and based on the sheet of Rav, she's a Bogeres Lefanenu. We assume she was a Bogeres at the time that the father was Makabel Kiddushin. And Shmuel says, no, we go back to the original state of Chazak Meikar, that she was a Nara Lo. The Gemara says that we don't have to do so. Shmuel. We can organize these two Brysos, both reflecting the sheet of Shmuel. Ad kan b'mach chashto v'kan b'she'ein mach chashto. What is the Bas saying when the father claims he was Makabel Kiddushin? If she says with her claim that she already had Simoni Bagus before the father was Makabel Kiddushin, then we accept her claim. And she's Nemenes because she has a Tainus Bari and she knows that she was a Bogeres. And her Tainus Bari is Machriya, the Tainus Av. However, the second Brisa, B'she'ein makhashto, the bas doesn't say anything to contradict the father who says, I was makabel Kiddushin for you at a time that you were a Nara. She just says that she herself was makabelas Kiddushin, and therefore she needs to get me safek from both the Kiddushei Habal, Ha'av, and her own Kiddushin. Now, once the Gemara gives this answer, the Gemara now opens up a new venue. Maybe there is no machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. We've been building and building on a machlok, on the assumptions machlokas. Nema minamasnisa lo pligi, amoroi nami lo pligi. If you've already reconciled the difference between the two brises, we can reconcile the difference between Rav and Shmuel. And what would that mean? That Rav is talking about a case where she was makrish the father, and she has a tiny bari. She knows that she was a bogeres at the time of his kabbalas Kiddushin, and Shmuel is in a case where she said nothing. V'tizbra, are you able to say this? Ha Rav Yosef Bereder Rav Menashe Madvil, Midvil, from a city called Dvil, Ovid Uvda Kavase de Rav, he paskin haloch l'mais like Rav, and only her Kiddushin wachal. The Ikvid Shmuel, and Shmuel was makbid of Yomi, and he said, "The lekuli alma kailu le bekabazuta." Can we say that all the chacham in the world should measure their chachma with a small midah ketana and high midrabanan? And this chacham, meaning Rav Yosef Rav Menashe kailu le bekabarabba, he measures out his chachma b'midah rabban, a great midah. In other words, Rav Yosef is being accused of relying on Rov Chachmaso and his great intelligence and his insight, and he's posketing that this Isha doesn't need a get from the father's suitor, and he's not choshish for a suffix ish. Now, Isal Kedaichelo Pligi Amaiko Makbid. Why was he makbid on Rav Yosef? And he called him this and he called him that, and he said, "How can you be matur neshus ish?" Maybe he's talking about a case of makhashto. Now the Gemara comes to a final conclusion. Amalei Mar Zutra Rav Ashi Hachi Amar Rav Meimar Hilchus Hakavasi de Shmuel v'Rav Ashi Amar Hilchus Hakavasi de Rav, and the final maskon is Hilchus Hakavasi de Rav Halokas Kira. Now in Kol Hashas we always passing like Rav against Shmuel b'Surim. Why did the Gemara feel it necessary? There was a whole debate here about whether halacha is kirab. And the answer is, since we found that Ameimar and Mazuch are two great Amoraim paskin like Shmuel, therefore the Gemara had to come to some definite conclusion that confirms our general universal rule that halacha kirav be'isure. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Ayin Tesom in Beis. And now we're talking about a man, a Kohen, who goes out to Medina Sayyam, and he has a wife, and he has a child. And the question is whether or not we can assume the wife is kshera, we can assume therefore the child is kosher. Misha yotza hu ve'ishto Medina Sayyam. And then after a certain amount of time, uba, he comes back, hu ve'ishto ubana. So not only does he come back with his wife, but now he has a son. The Omar, and he claims, Isha shiyotzas imil Medina Sayyam rehizu. This is my wife that I checked out with to Medina Sayyam. V'elu baneh, these are our children. And the Mishnah Paskin saying, Tzarech lahavi raya lo ala isha v'lo ala bani. We can assume that she is miucheses, and there's no psul, and therefore memela, her children are also ksherim and not psulim, and therefore there's no need to adduce the evidence of two witnesses, not for her and not for her children. And this is all based on the fact that before he married her, they checked out her yichus. And memela, her banim are considered miuchasim, just like their mother. However, Mesa, if when he comes back from Medina Sayyam, he has no wife, and he's claiming that his wife died back at the time that he was in Medina Sayyam, and Elu Banel, but we had checked out our yichus and established her as a kshera before he left to Medina Sayyam, is Mevi Rayala Bonavenu Mevi Rayala Isha. Right? We could assume that before he left to Medina Sayyam, before he married her, they checked out her yichus and she was a miyucheses, but he still has to bring a raya that these are the children of his wife. Weiter. Isha nasasi b'medina sayam v'arehi zu v'elu banea. If, on the other hand, a Kohen goes out to Medina Sayyam without a wife, comes back with a wife and children, and he says, this is the wife that I married out in Medina Sayyam, and this is her son, or these are our children, is Mevi Rayala Isha Ve'enetzarch Lavi Rayala Bun. We don't know that when he was out there in Medina Sayyam and he married a woman, that they were bodek her and to establish clearly and unquestionably that she was a miyucheses. And therefore, he's going to have to prove that his wife, his current wife, is miyucheses. He doesn't have to bring a proof for his banim, because if she's miyucheses, memela the banim are miyucheses. However, if he went out to Medina Sayyam without a wife, and he comes back with children, but without a wife, and he says that Mesa, I married a woman in Medina Sayyam and she died, V'elu banel, then tzarch lavi raya isha v'ala ban. It's not enough that he can prove and establish that the woman that he married and died was a miyucheses. He also has to bring a raya on the banim that they were born to this woman who died, and memela we know that she's a miyucheses. The Gemara says the following: Omar Rabba bar Avuna v'kulam. In all these various scenarios, bekruchim achareha. The Mishnah, when it says that you don't need to bring a raya on the yichus of the banim because you've already established the yichus of the mother, that's a case where they are kruchim achareha. They, like young children that gravitate towards the mother, and that proves that she is the mother. And the Gemara quotes a brayso to prove Rav Huna. Tanur Rabbanan, we learned to the brayso, Isha nasasi Medina Sayyam, Mevi rayala Isha ve'enitzarch lavi rayala banim. And the brayso says that only applies to banim ketanim, but Mevi rayala gdolim ve'enitzarch lavi rayala ketanim. There's no need to prove the yichus of the ketanim because they're kruchim acharela, and there's only a need to prove that the gedolim who are not kruchim acharela are her children. Says the brayso, the isha achas. If he married a woman in Medina Sayyam, but only one woman, avol b'shtei nashim, he has two wives, and maybe rayala isha al banim, bein gedolim al gedolim, bein al ketanim. Here, kruchim achareh doesn't prove anything, because it's possible that the biological mother of these children died, and they were raised by the other mother, by the other wife, and the isha shniya raised them in their kruchim achareh as if that was their biological mother. Amar Reish Lakish. Here we start the daf for today. Daf Pei